because, as already indicated, such a norm happens to exist, and we are engaged in observing it to the point of automaticity. It's not something that we have to even consciously calculate or estimate. It happens to exist. Our senses pick up on it. Our reflexes condition around it to enable habitual turnings and modifications of our gait and the direction of our walk and the speed and all these other factors involved in moving by locomotion of the body's own two legs from point A to point B. And the same goes with vehicular travel or any other kind of physical motion in proximity to another person when there's a finite space for which past a certain point there will be significant physical consequences for not observing these conditions. And once they're observed with great regularity under a certain context, it can be in a very complicated way demonstrated what I'm saying. For example, if you take a Chinese acrobatic circus, I mean, the things they're doing are not being consciously calculated in the same way that they would have to be for someone for whom those activities were novel. They've gone through the learning process of doing that to the point that it's almost automatic. In fact, if they do consciously attend what they're doing beyond a certain point, they will lose all the benefits of their training and interfere with the process, and this will lead to disastrous consequences. It's actually their ability not to focus on what they're doing beyond a certain point that enables them to do it so well. But if something were to occur which would distract them from that, then it would become evident simply because it contradicts an entire apparatus of habituation which is solidly based on empirical entrainment over a long period of time, and with a great deal of, in this case, with diligent attention paid to the activity, which became the entrainment of their habit. But when we're talking about simple things like getting around, people have been getting around in cities their whole lives these days. So, excuse me, I can tell when there's vectoring going on and what its cause may or may not be. There's not a sense of delusion in observing the obvious. But if in that, let's just say at a busy cafe that's already cramped and that I've seen has been cramped for a good amount of time, well, guess what? I've been to cramped cafes before. And unless human nature's changed dramatically since the last time, they're given ample amount of space for someone to move their body from point A to point B. If it's not enough to keep them from constantly veering toward a certain point that I have never seen them veer toward before in any other context, that's going to become obvious. First of all, it's going to begin to become obvious subconsciously. It's not going to be noticed at first very much because people do sometimes deviate from the norm. But in this case, the exception demonstrates the rule. So it's not something the nervous system on any fundamental level is going to become reprogrammed by noticing. There's no delusion implied by the circumstance so far because, in fact, there is a certain amount of a buffer zone between a norm and its contradiction. So that includes and allows for exceptions to it because it was formed in a matrix of varying degrees of consistency to that norm in the first place. There's a sort of variation that already occurs in the norm and is accounted for by the norm. So if it were to occur, though, past a certain point, one would begin to become aware of it. And then in that case, you would notice that, in fact, this wasn't something drummed up by some intentional consciousness or any effort to perceive or explain a perception. It's simply a perception invading the normative matrix of other perceptions, which had been, in the case of something as commonplace as someone passing your table or passing on the street or coughing or yawning or any other type of activity, well-established precedents for at what rate and with what intensity those things should be occurring, period. And if this is noticed to be inconsistent with the norm, and it doesn't seem well explicable by any obvious cause, then it needs to be addressed as at least something that's not yet been given any satisfying explanation. One doesn't automatically go, oh, that's normal. Quite the contrary. It's an abnormality that's not yet been explained. And we don't start by assuming that the cognitive system of the person noting the abnormality is somehow deluded from or derailed from recourse to empirical and rational means of reality testing. That's cart before the horse. If it were the case that were going on, then there should be some strong evidence that there is no argument for a norm or the perception of a deviation from it. But in fact, there should also be no good model for explaining the norm or the deviation from it. The explanation which prevents me from resorting to assuming intentionality on the part of those who are involved in the abnormal behavior requires, at minimum, that some subconscious trigger to the activity is involved. I myself don't believe that there's any strange aura about me or some atypical force emanating from me that could cause such activity. I don't see that there's any signals that I am putting out that says, hey, this is the appropriate autonomic response. An autonomic response being something not usually regulated by the intentional consciousness. At the same time, if it were an affected behavior, which were intended simply to appear as though we're an autonomic response, and it were intentional, I'm not familiar with what particular behavior or demeanor or appearance element of my appearance is supposed to be involved in that. But someone enlighten me, please. In that case, we're still looking for a reasonable explanation instead of assuming that one doesn't exist from the beginning. If someone were to in any way influence the environment of another person so that they were to begin to doubt the veracity of their own ability to observe such norms and deviations from them in their environment, and if this were done intentionally so as to cause that doubt and to disable the person's confidence in their own perceptions and therefore confidence to act on their perceptions, this would be called gaslighting. Is this known to exist? Yes, since long before the movie Gaslight. Why would it exist? Well, of course, as a form of psychological warfare, to harass someone's cognitive and ethical wherewithal until they became, in some way, disabled from taking responsible action in some context or another. In the case here, the model of explanation that I put forth about these autonomic response deviations in their normal occurrence is merely correlated with my presence or a presence is rather satisfactory given the knowledge of the motives, the methods, and the opportunities for this to occur. Someone can propose a better explanation based on logic and fact. I'd like to know what it is. No one's been forthcoming with it, and I've seen every fallacious kind of reference made to a better explanation or to the inadequacy of my explanation that can be imagined, and none of them or most of them are not worth answering at all, except as a exercise in categorizing fallacies. But it has been satisfactorily explained in terms of directed energy systems and partially witting, and by very varying degrees, completely witting, covert fifth column activities. Gaslighting is not something that's unique to the movie that I referenced, and it's not a newly developed technique in affecting the psychological state of targeted individuals or groups. There are various other means of influencing someone's sense of the awareness of their environment, besides deforming the regularity or intensity of any of those events. Another is actually changing the contents or inserting contents that simply would not normally be there. For example, voice to skull, also called voice of God weaponry, was deployed in the Iraq War in order to convince large numbers of Iraqi soldiers to throw down their weapons and surrender. And of course, they were then bulldozed into pits and buried alive. The effectiveness of this weapon system and its nature were concealed from the public, certainly not simply because of the implications of what that would mean about our capabilities in a military context, but because people might reasonably come to the insight that, like with other weapons deployed in war, they may also be deployed in order to support any type of overt or covert tyrannical regime bent on dominating the population at home. And given that these are directed energy systems that, if they were deployed, would have an excellent cover under the in the context of a psychiatric interpretation of the phenomena experienced by those targeted, it would only be to the benefit of those deploying such a weapon system in a covert and hostile fashion in the domestic arena by keeping them secret. In fact, if they weren't kept secret, it would almost ruin them for that use entirely. And it would also be very upsetting to the pharmaceutical industry, which has already been set up to funnel weaponized pseudo-medicine toward targeted population and part them from their money and from their dignity and their sanity in that process, as well as to act as a cover for many other syndromes, which are the results of directed energy attacks and can be best explained by them. And instead, we're left with the charlatanry of supposed syndromes derived from the etiology of the brain itself, for which no precise or at all any lesions have been found by medicine in order to provide an explanation for them. So their hocus pocus charade of explaining certain symptoms of experience as being the product of a disorder in the nervous system, which is simply due to the weak constitution of that person or its deviation from the norm in a typical environment, or because of some specific conventional trauma, is going to be debilitated if people become aware of a far more likely cause, and from which they can also derive, because of the agent behind that instrument, what the motive would be. And it would make far more sense in that light. The last frontier of full spectrum dominance over a population is control over the way that population thinks and chooses to act on what they perceive, including, therefore, control over what they perceive. So the psychological warfare, the Psy War, which has been ongoing for thousands of years in one form or another, has just become technologically augmented in the last couple centuries to such a degree as to lead to an exponential change in its capabilities. And people's ignorance of these capabilities put them exponentially behind the curve in coping with and dealing with those phenomena. So it's important, of course, to bring up this model of explanation because it's consistent with a paradigm that better explains the reason why certain things would be happening, such as certain types of as I say, covert fifth columnist behaviors, and puts them in a context which better explains why they would take that course of action instead of another. Because the purpose isn't to literally assault directly and straightforwardly the person. The purpose is to undermine the integrity of